The year is 1268. In the coastal fortress of Antioch, one of the last Crusader strongholds in the Holy Land, a young woman named Catherine prepares for evening prayer in the Church of St. Peter. She's 17, the daughter of a Genoese merchant who settled in Antioch 20 years ago when trade between Europe and the Levant still seemed possible. Outside the city walls, the Mamluk Sultan Baybars has positioned his army in a siege formation that everyone recognizes as final. Antioch will fall. It's not a question of if but when. What Catherine doesn't know, what none of the Christian women in Antioch understand yet, is that for them, death during the siege would be the merciful outcome. Because what the Mamluk Sultanate had perfected over decades of warfare was a system of capture, transportation, and exploitation that turned Christian women into commodities more valuable than gold or spices. And once you entered that system, escape was nearly impossible, and death would come to seem like a blessing you'd never receive. If you think you understand medieval slavery, you're about to discover that the Mamluk system was more sophisticated, more systematic, and more psychologically brutal than almost anything else in the medieval world. Here, we explore the documented histories that reveal how military efficiency and human cruelty combine to create one of history's most effective machines for destroying lives. Every view, every subscription helps us uncover the truths buried beneath centuries of sanitized historical narratives. Now let's return to Antioch, because the siege is about to end, and Catherine's nightmare is about to begin. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruling Egypt and Syria from 1250 to 1517, was one of the most militarily successful Islamic states in history. The Mamluks defeated the Mongols, crushed the last Crusader states, and established control over the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Their military effectiveness came from their unique slave soldier system. Warriors captured or purchased as children, converted to Islam, trained as elite cavalry, and formed into a professional army loyal only to the Sultan. But the Mamluk military machine required constant resources: money, weapons, horses, and slaves. The capture and sale of prisoners, particularly women and children from Christian territories, became a systematic revenue source that funded the Sultanate's military campaigns. This wasn't random pillaging. It was state-organized human trafficking on an industrial scale. When Antioch fell on May 18, 1268, after 4 days of siege, Sultan Baybars ordered his troops to divide the population according to established protocol. Military-age men were either killed immediately or taken as slave laborers for construction projects. The elderly and infirm were left behind, considered economically worthless. But women and children, especially younger women between 12 and 30 years old, were seized as valuable assets. The chronicler Abu al-Fida, who documented Baybars's campaigns, records that over 16,000 prisoners were taken from Antioch, the majority of them women and children. They were sorted, catalogued, and prepared for distribution according to Mamluk law. The Sultan took 1/5 as his personal property, called the khums. Military commanders received shares based on their rank. The remaining prisoners were divided among the soldiers or sold in slave markets to generate revenue for the state treasury. Catherine was among those designated for the Sultan's fifth. This might sound like a privileged position, but it meant something specific and terrible. Women claimed by the Sultan weren't necessarily kept in the royal harem. Most were redistributed as gifts to foreign rulers, sold to wealthy merchants, or assigned to nobles as rewards for service. Being Sultan's property meant you were valuable enough to be worth transporting carefully, and expensive enough to attract buyers who could afford premium prices. The journey from Antioch to Cairo took 7 weeks. The captives, chained in groups of 10 to 15, walked most of the distance. Mamluk caravan masters had perfected the logistics of moving large numbers of slaves efficiently. They knew how much food and water was required to keep prisoners alive without wasting resources. They knew how to prevent disease from spreading through the captive population. They knew how to minimize escape attempts through a combination of physical restraint, psychological manipulation, and strategic violence. A Venetian merchant's account, discovered in the Archivio di Stato di Venezia and published in a 2003 academic study of Mamluk slave trade, describes encountering a slave caravan in 1271, moving through Syria toward Egypt. He writes that the women were kept separate from male prisoners, chained together in lines that stretched for hundreds of meters. They were guarded by Mamluk soldiers on horseback, who carried whips and used them liberally on anyone who walked too slowly or showed signs of resistance. The merchant notes that many of the women appeared to be European, likely prisoners from recent Crusader defeats. What struck him most was their silence. They didn't cry or beg or call out. They simply walked, hour after hour, their eyes fixed on the ground. Catherine learned quickly that resistance meant punishment not just for herself, but for the entire group she was chained to. When one woman in her chain tried to escape during a rest stop, the guards beat all 10 women in the group, then killed the woman who had attempted to flee and made the others walk past her body. The message was clear: your survival depends on the compliance of everyone around you, so enforce discipline on each other or suffer together. This technique of collective punishment created a system where prisoners policed themselves, where any thought of resistance was suppressed not by guards, but by fellow captives who knew that one person's defiance would result in everyone suffering. When the caravan reached Cairo, the prisoners were taken to the slave markets in the Bayn al-Kasrain district, the area between the two Mamluk palaces. These markets were highly organized, with separate sections for different categories of slaves: domestic servants, agricultural workers, skilled craftsmen, and concubines. Christian women from Crusader territories were premium merchandise, exotic and valuable. They were cleaned, given new clothing, and displayed for potential buyers in a process that was both commercial transaction and ritualized humiliation. The 14th century historian Ibn Battuta, who traveled extensively through Mamluk territories, describes the slave markets in detail. He notes that female slaves were examined physically by buyers and their agents, sometimes stripped to verify their health and physical attributes. Virginity was a valuable commodity that significantly increased price, so intrusive examinations were standard practice. Women who protested or resisted during these examinations were beaten or threatened with being sent to lower quality markets, where they would be purchased for brothels rather than households. Catherine was purchased by a Syrian merchant named Ahmad ibn Khalil for 75 dinars, a substantial sum that reflected her youth, European features, and verified virginity. She was taken to his household in Damascus and assigned to the women's quarters, where she would serve his 3 wives and numerous children. This might sound like domestic service, relatively benign compared to other fates, but the reality was far more complex and psychologically devastating. In wealthy Mamluk households, Christian slave women occupied an ambiguous and precarious position. They were simultaneously servants and potential concubines, workers and property, human beings and commodities. The master of the house had absolute legal authority over them, including sexual access. Islamic law permitted men to have sexual relations with female slaves they owned, and this was considered neither adultery nor rape, but rather legitimate use of property. For Catherine and thousands like her, this meant living in constant awareness that at any moment the master might summon her. There was no refusal, no protection, no legal recourse. If she became pregnant, the child would be born into slavery. Though Islamic law did grant some protection to slave mothers, a slave woman who bore her master's child could not be sold, and would be freed upon the master's death. This created a perverse incentive structure where pregnancy might be the only path to eventual freedom, turning reproduction into a form of long-term survival strategy. But freedom for the mother came at the cost of the child's identity. Children of slave mothers were legally free, but socially marked. They inherited their father's status, but not their mother's trauma. For women like Catherine, watching children grow up in the household that enslaved their mothers created a unique form of psychological torture. Seeing your children thrive in a system that destroyed you. The domestic life of enslaved Christian women in Mamluk households is documented in legal records, court cases, and personal letters that have survived in Egyptian archives. A 2007 study by historian Yosef Rapoport analyzed hundreds of Mamluk-era court documents and found recurring patterns of abuse, exploitation, and psychological control. Enslaved women who complained of mistreatment to Qadis Islamic judges were almost never freed. Instead, they were typically returned to their masters with instructions for the master to treat them more gently. The legal system acknowledged that slaves had some rights, including protection from extreme physical abuse, but the threshold for what constituted extreme was so high that most forms of everyday violence fell below it. Some women tried to convert to Islam, hoping that conversion would improve their status. Islamic law technically required that Muslims not be enslaved, but in practice, conversion did little to change the situation of women already in slavery. They remained property even after conversion, though their children would be born Muslim and therefore free. The Mamluk legal system created elaborate theological justifications for why conversion didn't equal freedom for people who were already enslaved before converting, effectively closing the one loophole that might have offered escape. Catherine's master, Ahmad ibn Khalil, considered himself a pious and merciful Muslim. He prayed 5 times a day, made charitable donations, and ensured his household observed Islamic law. He also used Catherine sexually whenever he wished, beat her when she failed to show proper deference, and never once considered that his actions might contradict his religious principles. This wasn't hypocrisy in his mind. It was the normal order of things, sanctioned by law, tradition, and religious authority. The slave markets in Cairo continued operating throughout the Mamluk period, processing thousands of captives every year. The Sultanate maintained a bureaucracy specifically for managing the slave trade. Officials who assessed and categorized prisoners, scribes who maintained records of ownership, tax collectors who ensured the state received its share of sale revenues. Archaeological excavations in Cairo have uncovered buildings that served as slave warehouses, holding facilities where prisoners were kept between capture and sale. The remains show evidence of crowded conditions, minimal sanitation, and high mortality rates. For every woman who survived the capture, transport, and sale process, several others died along the way. The systematic nature of the Mamluk slave system distinguished it from earlier, more haphazard forms of slavery. This was bureaucratic human trafficking, with paperwork, standardized procedures, and professional slave traders who specialized in procuring, transporting, and selling human beings. The efficiency was impressive in the same way that industrial systems are impressive, not because of moral value but because of organizational sophistication. The psychological impact of this system on its victims was compounded by its permanence. Unlike prisoners of war who might hope for ransom or exchange, enslaved women in the Mamluk system had virtually no chance of freedom. European attempts to ransom Christian captives were sporadic and reached only a tiny fraction of those enslaved. The vast majority would spend their entire lives in bondage, would die as property, and would be buried in unmarked graves if buried at all. Catherine lived in Damascus for 23 years. She bore 3 children to Ahmad ibn Khalil, none of whom ever acknowledged her as their mother in any public setting. When Ahmad died in 1291, Catherine was freed according to Islamic law. But freedom at 40 years old with no family, no resources, and no legal status meant little. She died 2 years later, her name appearing one final time in a court record regarding the distribution of Ahmad's estate. The record lists her as Catherine al-Frangiya, Catherine the Frank, identifying her by her origin even after decades in Damascus. She was buried in a public cemetery with no marker. Her children, now wealthy members of Damascus society, did not attend her funeral. This is what fate worse than death looked like in the Mamluk system. Not a single moment of horrible violence, but decades of systematic dehumanization, the slow erosion of identity and dignity, the permanent separation from everything you were before, and the knowledge that your suffering was legal, normal, and would never end. The Mamluk Sultanate fell in 1517 to the Ottoman Empire, but the slave systems it had perfected continued under new management. The routes, markets, and legal frameworks remained largely intact. The women who suffered under the Mamluk system had no memorials, no monuments, no recognition. Most of their names are lost, but the bureaucratic records survive. Hundreds of documents in Egyptian and Syrian archives cataloging the buying and selling of human beings with the same casual precision used to record trade in spices or textiles. These documents are uncomfortable to read because they make clear that what happened to women like Catherine wasn't aberration. It wasn't aberration. It wasn't the cruelty of individual bad actors. It was the systematic operation of a sophisticated state that had turned human trafficking into a revenue stream and justified it through law and religion. If this history disturbs you, that discomfort is important. It prevents us from romanticizing medieval civilizations, from pretending that military sophistication equals moral advancement, or from believing that religious authority guarantees ethical behavior. The Mamluk Sultanate was one of the most successful Islamic states in history, and that success was built partly on the systematic exploitation of enslaved women, whose suffering funded armies, enriched merchants, and maintained social hierarchies. Leave a comment with your thoughts on how slavery was institutionalized in medieval societies. Subscribe to continue exploring the histories that force us to confront the uncomfortable truths about how power operates and how suffering gets normalized when it serves those in authority. Because understanding the mechanisms of historical oppression is the only way to recognize when similar patterns emerge in the present.